Inside a medieval castle, winter offered no mercy. Stone walls that promised protection instead trapped cold like a slow, invisible frost. Long corridors carried draughts day and night, and warmth belonged to those closest to power. Pages and squires slept far from hearths, waking before dawn with stiff fingers and numb feet. What kept them alive was not comfort, but habit, discipline, and an early education in enduring cold without complaint. To modernize, a medieval castle looks like a fortress against the elements. Thick walls, narrow windows, towering stone, everything suggests shelter. But for those living inside, especially pages and squires, winter transformed these structures into cold reservoirs. Stone absorbed chill during long winter nights and released it slowly throughout the day, making interiors feel perpetually damp and frigid. Unlike wood, stone never truly warmed, even when a fire burned nearby. Large halls amplified the problem. High ceilings trapped cold air above, while drafts slipped through doors, arrow slits, and imperfect joints in the masonry. Wind did not stop at the walls. It travelled through corridors like a restless presence, turning movement into a constant shiver. Fireplaces, though impressive, were inefficient. They warmed only the immediate area in front of the hearth, leaving the rest of the room untouched by heat. For pages and squires, who were rarely allowed near these fires, the castle offered no refuge from winter. Their daily reality was waking to frozen breath indoors, washing with icy water, and performing duties in spaces that felt no warmer than the outside yard. Castles promised safety from enemies, not comfort from nature. In winter, the cold was not an exception, it was a permanent condition of indoor life. Pages and squires occupied the lowest rungs of the household hierarchy, and their sleeping arrangements reflected this clearly. Private chambers were reserved for nobles, senior knights, and high-ranking servants. Young attendants slept wherever space was available, shared dormitories, corridors, lofts, or rooms near storage areas. These locations were chosen for convenience, not warmth. Many slept close to stables or supply rooms, where dampness to hearths and cold were unavoidable. Straw bedding provided minimal insulation from stone floors, and wooden partitions did little to block drafts. Privacy was non-existent, but neither was warmth. Being near the main halls did not help, as fires were extinguished overnight to save fuel. By morning, indoor temperatures often matched the freezing air outside. This lack of personal space forced young servants to adapt early. Sleep was light, interrupted by cold, noise, and the need to rise before dawn. Yet these conditions were normalized. Complaining marked weakness, and endurance was quietly expected. For pages and squires, cold nights were part of learning their place in the world. Survival meant accepting discomfort as routine, long before dreams of knighthood or honour ever felt real. For pages and squires, clothing was not about appearance but survival. Wool was their greatest defence against the cold. Unlike linen, wool retained warmth even when damp, making it essential in drafty, unheated interiors. Young attendants wore multiple layers whenever possible: a linen undertunic, a wool tunic, hose, and often a cloak that stayed on even indoors. Removing clothing for comfort was a luxury they could not afford. At night, most slept fully dressed. Cloaks doubled as blankets, and hoods were pulled tight around the head to reduce heat loss. Garments were patched repeatedly, not replaced. Frayed cuffs and worn knees were signs of use, not neglect. A hole meant cold air against the skin, so basic sewing skills were part of daily life. Footwear mattered as well. Leather shoes lined with wool scraps or straw helped insulate feet from frozen floors. Gloves were rare, but sleeves were often pulled over hands during rest. Clothing absorbed smells of smoke and sweat, yet it was never washed often in winter, as wet fabric meant danger. Warmth came not from elegance, but from layers and habit. For these boys, clothing became a portable shelter, the only warmth they could carry with them through stone corridors and long winter days. Sleep was one of the coldest challenges of castle life. Without fires burning through the night, temperatures dropped quickly after sunset. To survive, pages and squires relied on shared body heat. Beds were rarely individual. Instead, several boys slept together on straw pallets or narrow wooden platforms. Physical closeness was not comfort, it was necessity. Bodies conserved warmth more efficiently together. Shared blankets of wool or rough fur trapped heat, while straw provided limited insulation from stone floors. Turning away from others meant losing warmth, so sleep often happened shoulder to shoulder, limbs overlapping. Privacy disappeared, but survival improved. Solitary sleeping was the coldest option, and usually reserved for those on night duty or guarding entrances. These nights were remembered for numbness rather than rest. Even then, boys often returned to shared sleeping spaces once duties ended. This communal sleep also shaped social bonds. Cold erased distance quickly. Rivalries softened when warmth depended on cooperation. Silence filled the room, broken only by breathing and the wind outside. In winter castles, warmth was shared because it had to be. For pages and squires, learning to sleep together was not about friendship. It was about staying alive until morning. Fire was the most controlled resource inside a medieval castle, and pages and squires were rarely its beneficiaries. Firewood required labour to cut, transport, and store, making every log valuable. As a result, heat followed hierarchy. Hearths burned brightest in noble chambers, council rooms, and dining halls during meals or gatherings. Once these spaces were vacated, fires were allowed to die down. Young attendants were expected to function in the leftover cold. They slept far from hearths and performed early morning duties before fires were relit. Even when allowed near a fire during work, they could not linger. Warmth was temporary and conditional, tied to service rather than comfort. At night, embers buried in ash were sometimes used as a weak source of heat. Buckets of ash stayed warm until morning, and hands were briefly held near them before chores began. This small warmth was practical, not indulgent. Fire existed to serve the household, not the bodies of the lowest-ranked members. Cold reinforced order. Knowing where warmth belonged reminded pages and squires of their position. Heat was a privilege, not a right, and winter made this hierarchy impossible to ignore. Movement was one of the most reliable defences against the cold. Pages and squires spent much of their day in constant motion, carrying messages, cleaning halls, tending animals, and assisting knights. Physical labour generated heat when fires could not. Standing still was the fastest way to feel winter bite into skin. Chores began before sunrise when cold was at its worst. Fetching water, sweeping stone floors, or preparing equipment forced blood to circulate. Over time, bodies adapted to these conditions. Muscles stayed active, and endurance replaced comfort. Stillness brought danger. Long waits, night watches, or moments of idleness made the cold sharper and more exhausting. Young attendants learned quickly to keep moving. Even small motions like pacing or rubbing hands together mattered. Work structured survival. Daily routines were designed not only for efficiency, but for warmth. Labour kept bodies alive in spaces where fires could not. For pages and squires, the lesson was simple and lasting. In winter castles, motion was warmth, and rest was a luxury rarely granted. In winter, food served a different purpose for pages and squires. It was not meant to satisfy appetite, but to sustain heat and strength. Meals were simple and repetitive, centred around warm liquids rather than solid portions. Thick stews, broths, and pottages were common because they could be eaten hot and digested slowly, helping the body maintain warmth longer. Grain-based foods dominated the diet. Barley, oats, and rye provided steady energy, while vegetables preserved through drying or salting filled out meals. Meat appeared rarely for young servants, and when it did, it was often boiled into broth rather than served in large pieces. Fat, when available, was valuable. Even small amounts of animal fat or butter added to stews increased calorie intake and helped fight cold exhaustion. Hot food also offered psychological relief. Holding a warm bowl between cold hands mattered as much as nutrition. Meals were timed to restore strength during the coldest parts of the day, especially after morning labour or before evening duties. Eating cold food in winter was avoided whenever possible. For pages and squires, survival depended less on how much they ate and more on how warm their meals were. Heat on the tongue meant heat in the body, even if only for a short time. Service in a castle began early. Many boys entered as pages before adolescence, when bodies were still adapting to the world. Exposure to cold was not gradual, it was immediate and constant. Over time, discomfort became normal. Cold floors, icy water, and drafty rooms shaped their daily experience, training them to endure rather than resist. Complaints were discouraged, sometimes openly, often silently. Endurance was associated with discipline and obedience. Learning to function despite discomfort was considered part of proper upbringing. Those who adapted were praised, those who struggled learned to hide it. Bodies changed alongside behaviour, circulation improved, tolerance increased, and reactions to cold dulled with repetition. More importantly, the mind adjusted. Cold became expected, not feared. This mental adaptation was as crucial as physical resilience. By the time a squire approached knighthood, winter no longer shocked him. Cold had become routine, woven into daily life. Endurance was not accidental. It was cultivated deliberately. In medieval castles, learning to withstand cold was an unspoken lesson, shaping obedience and resilience long before armour was ever worn. Winter inside a medieval castle was not only uncomfortable but dangerous. Cold and damp air created ideal conditions for illness, especially among young pages and squires whose bodies were under constant strain. Persistent coughs, chest tightness, and fevers spread quickly through shared sleeping spaces. Once sickness appeared, it was difficult to contain. Warm, isolated rooms were rare, and rest was a privilege few could afford. Medical knowledge offered limited help. Treatments focused on balancing humours, not preventing exposure. Herbal remedies, warm drinks, and extra blankets were the most common responses, but recovery was slow when cold never fully left the body. Many continued working while ill, worsening their condition and spreading sickness further. Damp stone walls trapped moisture, aggravating respiratory problems and joint pain. Wet clothing dried slowly indoors, increasing the risk of chills. In winter, even minor illnesses could become serious simply because warmth was scarce. Survival often depended on resilience rather than care. Despite these risks, illness was treated as part of service. Endurance in sickness was valued nearly as much as endurance in cold. For pages and squires, surviving winter meant avoiding weakness as much as avoiding frost. Pages and squires survived the cold inside medieval castles through adaptation, not comfort. Warmth came from routine, layered clothing, shared sleep, constant movement, and hot food, rather than from fires or personal space. Hierarchy dictated who deserved heat, and young servants learned early that survival required acceptance of discomfort. This endurance shaped them long before knighthood. Cold taught discipline, obedience, and resilience, reinforcing social order as much as physical survival. What appears harsh by modern standards was considered normal, even necessary, in a world where comfort was rare and resources limited. There is a quiet lesson here. Survival is not always about strength or protection, but about learning to function within constraints. Pages and squires endured because they adapted together, sharing warmth, labour, and routine. Their story reminds us that resilience is often built in silence, shaped not by heroic moments, but by countless cold mornings endured without complaint.